Refugees at sea. Meanwhile, the U.S. Nav why ships offshore struggled to cope with the flood of evacuees. To direct the aircraft coming from Saigon, Task Force 76 established the Helicopter Direction Center, HDC, aboard Okinawa that sent flights to an open deck on either an amphibious ship or one of the helicopter carriers. The amphibious ships steamed in a line inshore of the carriers to try to lighten the work of the extremely busy warships. This operation resembled a railroad switching yard, with HDC allocating helos to clear decks and thus spreading the load of evacuees as evenly as possible among the ships. A desperate Vietnam Air Force pilot abandons his helicopter dangerously close to Blue Ridge and other warships of the evacuation fleet. Even the carriers were soon overwhelmed by the large numbers of South Vietnamese aircraft. 13 ARVN helicopters landed on Hancock during the morning of April 29th. These aircraft brought out to the ship 141 refugees, mostly relatives of the Vietnamese crewmen. By the end of Operation Frequent Wind, aboard Midway were 3 Vietnamese CH-47s, 40 UH, 1 Hueys, and 1 Cessna, 1 Bird Dog, plus 5 Air America Hueys, all, of course, in addition to the ship's own aircraft. As decks became jammed with refugee aircraft, American sailors had no choice but to push some over the side to make way for others. The amphibious US transport docked Duluth, LPD-6, crewmen jettisoned 7 Hueys in quick succession. Blue Ridge sailors push a UH-1B Iroquois over the side to make room for other helicopters bringing South Vietnamese military personnel and their families out to the evacuation fleet. During April 29th, both South Vietnamese aircraft and U.S. helicopters arrived with maximum loads. 1 CH-46 flew on a Duluth with 45 people. Aboard, CH-53s sometimes carried more than 70 individuals. 1 UH-1E Huey, designed for 12 infantrymen, arrived on Midway packed with 50 people, mostly children. 1 HH-53C pilot noted that, with baggage left behind and a high proportion of the diminutive Asian women and children among the passengers, he carried more than 100 evacuees out of Saigon in one flight. Refugees coming out in American helicopters were allowed to bring 1 small handbag, but U.S. rules did not apply on South Vietnamese aircraft, some of which arrived with a miscellany of belongings, in one case, a broken-down motorcycle. Sometimes an escaping South Vietnamese airman would load his family and their possessions but threaten to kill anyone else who tried to board the aircraft. The hectic pace of operations, coupled with few spare pilots, compelled air crews to put in long hours. South Vietnamese aircraft descend on the fleet. Complicating the helicopter flow was the appearance of more than 60 South Vietnamese aircraft. In the words of one Marine, the result was a veritable demolition derby around and aboard USN helodecks. Only skillful flying by USMC pilots and quick actions by deck crews prevented serious loss of personnel and equipment. Incoming VNAF helos cut off USMC helos on their final approaches and refused to be waved off. It was not uncommon to have 2 to 3 VNAF helos all trying to land at one time. A Hancock crewman recalled, "To this day, I'm still very surprised we didn't have any mid-air collisions, because they were coming from every direction. In a hostile environment and often in bad weather, the hardest kind of flying, in the words of one SINCPAC message to Washington. Most aviators flew 12 to 17 hours with a record set at 22. 5 hours by a Marine air crewman. Midway's 4 Sea King helicopters of Helicopter Combat Support Squadron. 1 HC-1, Detachment 2 logged 60. 9 hours of flight time and made 158 landings aboard 6 different ships. The 4 aircraft rescued 1,600 refugees, with 4 tons of belongings. Marine helicopters flew 590 sorties during the 17-hour period. It was complete chaos. Those helicopters were coming so frequently, the sky was dark from jet exhaust. Kirk alone handled 14 South Vietnamese helicopters. The pilot of one Boeing CH-47 Chinook, too large to land on Kirk's stern, hovered while his passengers jumped into the waiting arms of the American sailors and then put his aircraft down in the sea. Blue Ridge became a magnet for fugitive ARVN helicopters. The command ship recorded 15 attempts at landing on deck, 6 helicopters ditching alongside, 1 crash, ING on the flight deck, and one plowing into the starboard side of the ship after the pilot bailed out. Fortunately, damage to the ship was cosmetic. Marine After Action Report for Frequent Wind said of the air crews, they were tasked to the limits and performed superbly. Their discipline was excellent. Despite ample provocation, they did not fire around. Of course, essential to the success of the entire operation was the serviceability of the aircraft. A Marine comment encapsulated this critical dimension. Availability of helicopters was the most critical readiness thing that we had to keep up. It is a tribute to the crew chiefs who did a superhuman job. Sailors on board Kirk wave off the CH-47 Chinook Oper, aiding dangerously close to the destroyer escort. A CH-47 Chinook comes apart in the sea just after its pilot, shown in the water to the right of the helicopter, safely lowered his passengers onto Kirk and then ditched the aircraft. He survived the daring exploit. The ships worked as hard as the aircraft. The heavy cruiser Oklahoma City, overwhelmed with desperate South Vietnamese pilots, flew off Vice Admiral Steele's command helicopter and took aboard 12 ARVN aircraft loaded with 154 refugees. The amphibious assault ship Okinawa registered more than 1,000 landings and departures during the 30 hours her deck personnel were at flight quarter stations from 0400 on April 29th to 1000 the next day. Even after 1000, the flight deck remained busy as helicopters transferred evacuees and shuttled injured refugees to other ships for medical care. Crowds of evacuees strained the facilities of their host ships to the utmost. Midway took aboard 3,073 refugees. Okinawa, 1,200, some of whom were familiar faces from Eagle Pull, especially the newsmen and women who were beginning to think of the Okinawa as home, despite the transfer of evacuees from the carriers to other ships. Midway found herself packed with more than 1,000 refugees still aboard during the night of 29 to 30 April. As all available berthing spaces filled, many South Vietnamese spent the night on mats or blankets in the hangar bay. Crew members on Hancock set up wooden troughs flushed by seawater as emergency toilet facilities. One of the carrier's corpsmen remembered, the refugees didn't use the troughs for that purpose. They began washing their clothes in them. I don't know whether or not they were also using them for toilets. They may have been washing their clothes up forward and then toileting aft. Amphibious ships with their cavernous spaces coped best. Temporary screening shelters allowed U.S. personnel to disarm the new arrivals and to route those with acute medical problems to the proper facilities. The amphibious cargo ship Mobile, LK-115, reported. Feeding was done in relays of mess personnel who carried big GI government issue cans around the various levels of the hold, ladling out an American attempt at Oriental stew. The food was hot and there was plenty of it, and the refugees did not seem to mind the inconvenience. Head facilities were built out over the side of the ship by the hull technicians and fresh drinking water. And washing services were supplied continuously by garden hoses. The Denver crew first bedded down more than 500 refugees in a tent city erected amid abandoned helicopters on the flight deck, and then processed 7,500 Vietnamese in the well deck. The amphibious transport Vancouver, LPD-2, handled 2,200 evacuees. From the larger warships, the refugees boarded landing craft for transfer to nearby MSC ships. Sailors faced heavy workloads. The hours became incredibly long as Marine helos came aboard with load after load of refugees, yet the crew of Denver willingly stayed on the job, assisting and feeding. Thousands of them, Okinawa Aknal, edged. All hands were taxed to their maximum endurance in carrying out their duties, as well as accommodating evacuees. From Vietnam, simultaneous with the airborne opera tie-ins, but much less publicized, came a seaborne evacuation. Although the rules of engagement kept U.S. Navy ships from approaching closer than a mile to the coast of South Vietnam, this restriction did not apply to MSC ships with their marine security detachments. Both MER, chance seamen, and Marines did yeoman work. 4 MSC-controlled ships, SS Green Wave, SS Pioneer Commander, SS Pioneer Contender, and SS Green Forest, were at Saigon. 5 more were at Vung Tau, USNS Greenville Victory, USNS Sergeant Andrew Miller, TK, 242, USNS Sergeant Truman Kimbrough, TK, 244, SS Greenport, and SS American Challenger, with the SS Pioneer contractor steaming from the Philippines for that port. Now, all remaining shipping that could move, including 1 LST plus various smaller watercraft, headed downriver from Saigon. 5 MSC tugs pulled barges filled with refugees. One of the craft carried an estimated 6,000 evacuees. From Cano, the American Consul General and his party, plus numerous South Vietnamese refugees, escaped down the Bossac River in amphibious landing craft, harassed by small arms and rocket fire during their 16-hour ordeal. The party reached the sea without loss and rendezvoused with 2 American ships, Barber County, LST, 1195, and Pioneer Contender. By daybreak on April 30th, all vessels had cleared the shipping channels and were anchored at Vung Tau. In that roadstead, 7 MSC and U.S. NAV Y ships loaded refugees for transit onward. Wilson, DDG-7, went to general quarters, at which point the firing stopped. In another episode fraught with tension, SGT, Andrew Miller was taking refugees aboard when a South Vietnamese helicopter crashed into a barge alongside, injuring evacuees moments later, crewmen of a South Vietnamese ship. Orders soon reached the ships at Vung Tau. They were to move 20 miles south to a position out of sight of land to preclude uncontrolled refugees from approaching. Throughout the withdrawal, combat air patrols flown from Coral Sea and Enterprise offered insurance against intervention by enemy aircraft. Stationed about 90 miles off South Vietnam, Coral Sea launched 66 sorties. The nuclear carrier, 95, including 20 flown by Grumman F-14A Tomcats. Enterprise was the first ship to operate the new fighter. Neither carrier wing expended ordnance. Enterprise lost 1 LTV Corporation, a 7E Corsair, to an undetermined cause. Overall, given the scope of Operation Frequent Wind and the conditions around Saigon, casualties were remarkably light. Operational losses included 1 AH, 1J Cobra ditched due to fuel exhaustion when the landing space on Kirk was preempted by an Air America helicopter. Kirk rescued both airmen. A CH-46 search and rescue helicopter crashed near Hancock. 2 crewmen, Marine Captain William C. Nistel and Marine First Lieutenant Michael J. Shea, died on April 29th, the last U.S. aviator casualties of the war in Vietnam. Enemy action took an even lighter toll. As noted earlier, rockets killed 2 Marines on the ground shortly before the start of frequent wind. Hostile anti-aircraft fire lightly damaged 1 helicopter. By American reckoning, the Communists fired perhaps a dozen SA-7 anti-aircraft missiles at U.S. helicopters during the evacuation. Although none scored, 1 exploded so close the aircraft crew initially thought it had hit. By way of contrast, escaping South Vietnamese aircraft suffered several losses to the SA-7 missiles. Later analysis attributed the overall enemy failure to several factors. A mission altitude from 1,500 to 4,000 feet that gave the U.S. crewmen time to spot and react to the SA-7 missiles by making a hard turn into the missile's path and firing flares. The relatively high flight profile also kept the helicopters above the effective range of small arms fire. Analysts also concluded low infra-red reflective paint helped. Mulling over the slight enemy resistance, 1 Air America pilot believed the North Vietnamese command had issued very firm marching orders to minimize casualties on the part of America. Vice Admiral Steele came to the same conclusion. In a December 1975 interview, he commented, "Thought it had hit." By way of contrast, escaping South Vietnamese aircraft suffered several losses to the SA-7 missiles. Later analysis attributed the overall enemy failure to several factors. A mission altitude from 1,500 to 4,000 feet that gave the U.S. crewmen time to spot and react to the SA-7 missiles by making a hard turn into the missile's path and firing flares. The relatively high flight profile also kept the helicopters above the effective range of small arms fire. Analysts also concluded low infra-red reflective paint helped. Mulling over the slight enemy resistance, 1 Air America pilot believed the North Vietnamese command had issued very firm marching orders to minimize casualties on the part of America. Vice Admiral Steele came to the same conclusion. In a December 1975 interview, he commented, "Gee, these fellows must have consciously let us go, because they could have done a lot worse to us. But I wondered also if their command and control was good enough to react so quickly to tell their people to let us go. If so, I kind of think that was a sound idea on their part. What the heck, if the Americans are going, let them go. The only problem is, of course, they were letting a lot of their enemies out too. Maybe they thought, well, good riddance. It'll save us a lot of trouble in the long run. They were losing a lot of money. All these people, top South Vietnamese, came out loaded with diamonds and cash, and so forth that they had saved largely, I think, through bilking us over the years. But at any rate, the North Vietnamese and the indigenous VC were losing that. But I think probably they looked at the POS abilities for the counteraction on our part at the time with all that air there, and they figured it's just as well to let it go. Frequent wind, like the earlier Eagle pull, had been a risky thing. In the words of Yuri W. Patrick, an analyst from the Center for Naval Analyses, we were lucky this time. The last Marines lifted off from Saigon at 0743 on April 30th, barely 2 hours later. North Vietnamese soldiers were marching down the streets of Saigon at 1024 President Duong Phuong. men announced the unconditional surrender of the Republic of Vietnam. More dramatic, shortly after noon, a communist tank crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Still, as a U.S. Army team later concluded of Operation Frequent Wind, all in all, the evacuation of 130,000 Vietnamese was an admirable feat in itself, comparable in every aspect to a successful military operation. This was a far cry for what had happened at Da Nang, Nha Trang, and even Phnom Penh. By this one measure, Operation Frequent Wind rivaled that of Operation Overlord when Allied warships and aircraft put ashore 160,000 soldiers in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Pentagon staffers concluded in a post-mortem at the end of May they were satisfied with the conduct of the operation. Vice Admiral Steele received the Distinguished Service Medal. Kudos went especially to the aviators, Marines, and sailors who had done the heavy lifting. But the praise tasted bittersweet. Vice Admiral Steele concluded, "I hope it never happens again. I don't like to be in charge of a rear guard." On April 30th, 1975, Henry B. Wilson came to aid of USNS Sergeant Andrew Miller, TK 242, which panicky South Vietnamese refugees were threatening to overwhelm. SGT, Andrew Miller, Southeast Asia. Passage to the Philippines. Operation Frequent Wind ended officially on May 1st, but refugees continued to stream out of Vietnam on a wide array of craft. During the preceding week, top officers of the Vietnam Nav had begun planning for evacuation of their ships. Heroic efforts by the shipyard at Saigon had put almost all VNN vessels into at least marginally seaworthy condition. Now, virtually every ship that could put to sea was on the move. 26 warships carrying an estimated 30,000 refugees, mostly families of the South Vietnamese sailors. These were soon joined by 4 Cambodian ships, plus 2 LSTs from the Republic of China and another from South Korea. Du Kim, the officer shown pointing during a wartime naval operation, was involved in planning the 1975 evacuation of the Vietnam Navy from Saigon and the Mekong Delta. Also streaming away from the communist victors were vast numbers of fishing boats of varying degrees of seaworthiness. Lieutenant Commander Hugh J. Doyle, the engineering officer on Kirk, recorded his impressions. A warship of the Vietnam Navy, loaded with civilian refugees, heads for the Philippines. Somebody in the wardroom that morning told me, "You ought to see all the fishing boats." I looked over toward the beach, which was about 12 miles away, and there were so many fishing boats, I could hardly see the water. They were all swarming out, all flying Vietnamese flags, going as fast as these little old junk-type boats could go. One looked like someone had taken a candy bar, laid it on the sidewalk, and let the ants get at it. The U.S. ships were taking them as fast as they could, but there was a bit of panic. This was because the fishermen and peasants in the boats were a lot less sophisticated than the military people and urban families who had come out on the Hellos the previous day. The Hello people were relatively calm. The Vietnamese fishermen and peasants, on the other hand, were just in a frenzy. By one U.S. estimate on that day, more than 500 small craft were in the water between the task force and Vung Tau. American sailors frequently noted some of these refugees were people of means and education. As one Hancock crewman remarked, "We called them refugees, but they weren't in wretched condition. They were from Saigon, a big city, and were mostly middle class." A corpsman on Kirk concluded, "The refugees were in pretty good shape. I thought about tuberculosis, dysentery, all the diseases endemic in Vietnam." Richard Armitage, a 3-tour U.S. naval advisor, confidante of many South Vietnamese naval officers and future Deputy Secretary of State, poses for a photo as a representative of the Defense Attaché Office. Armitage assisted the Vietnam Navy's departure from the Republic of Vietnam. But these refugees were the upper crust of Vietnamese society. In fact, many came aboard with shoe boxes full of gold, which we confiscated to prevent a situation in which theft might occur. We gave the people a receipt. Some of the Vietnamese also brought along their pets. Captain Jacobs, the commanding officer of Kirk, received an order to get rid of all the animals. They wanted me to take pets from the kids and throw the animals over the side. So the XO executive officer said, "What do you want to do, Captain?" I replied, "You answer the message. Tell the powers that be that the action is done, and then don't do a goddamn thing." Had I followed that order, I would have had a riot on my hands. The mass exodus by the Vietnam Navy vessels surprised the American command, which learned of it only as the ships were underway. Kirk, the U.S. destroyer escort sent by Vice Admiral Steele to assist the Vietnamese, soon reported most of the ships were, at best, in marginal condition. Some were towing others. Many lacked essential supplies and personnel. Responding to their plight, U.S. warships dispatched salvage and repair parties to try to keep the Vietnamese craft afloat. Other American naval craft loaned their medical detachments. Mobile, for example, transferred her ship's doctor and 3 corpsmen to Kirk to act as circuit medics for the Vietnamese vessels. Still, other U.S. warships provided essentials, with Duluth sending food, water, and medical supplies to 2 refugee craft off her stern, one of which was loaded with about 230 ARVN soldiers and the other carrying 200 children. An American report noted on other South Vietnamese boats. Numerous prospective mothers are in late stages of pregnancy. By their very nature, military forces did not have readily available certain items necessary for civilians. One Marine listed the following examples of non-military items required for the efficient, humane sanitary processing of civilian refugees: sundry packs, toilet paper, baby bottles, Kotex pads, water containers, blankets, paper/plastic eating utensils, disposable diapers, and clothing items. Commander Paul Jacobs, commanding officer of the destroyer escort Kirk. MSC Shipping, split into 3 groups based on speed, each with a U.S. Navy ship as escort, thickened the refugee flood. All vessels were crowded to burst. ING, with Greenville Victory, reporting 400 aboard and 6,148 on Sergeant Andrew Miller. When the task. 476 surgeon inspected the MSC ships. He found the passengers short of water and the holds especially hot. He ordered periodic health checks and suggested the ships put into the Philippines to replenish water supplies and allow refugees to go ashore. The destroyer escort Kirk proved to be a godsend to many refugees needing help on the high seas off Vietnam in May 1975. Of this maritime miscellany, the Korean tank landing ship LST-117 with 3,000 refugees in the 10-knot MSC convoy presented a special problem. One Marine aviator remembered it was hot out there in that ocean, and the LST went dead in the water, and we couldn't get those people water. We tried to drop them water from the helicopters. We only had 2 little Hueys working at that time aboard Blue Ridge. There was nothing we could do. If we had landed, those 2 Hueys would never have gotten off. That would have been just suicide on our part. Several South Vietnamese ships broke down altogether. 7th Fleet sailors scuttled 4 craft to eliminate hazards to navigation. Fortunately, most refugee vessels were in better condition, but to be safe, P-3 Orion patrol aircraft check them daily during their 7-day transit time to Subic Bay. Other problems would arise when the Armada reached the Philippines, a country justifiably concerned about this incoming human tide. Refugees, finally safe on board a 7th Fleet ship, managed smiles. AP-3 Orion patrol plane investigates a vessel in the South China Sea. Maritime refugee. A more immediate challenge for the U.S. Navy lay in the necessity to organize the refugees still aboard the U.S. warships. Given the frenetic nature of the Evacuation, this sorting process proved a complex one. Thus far, no effective security screening had taken place. Due to the difficulties imposed by the time-sensitive atmosphere and corruption in South Vietnam. For the Navy, a worry was that hostile intelligence services have endeavored to exploit this situation by infiltration of controlled agents into evacuee groups, a concern that apparently was unfounded. Faced with huge numbers of refugees and a potential security concern, the Navy was anxious to transfer as quickly as possible virtually all the South Vietnamese from its warships to the MSC ships or other merchantmen. As boats and helicopters fled refugees back and forth, the activity served as a magnet for additional large numbers of Vietnamese who struck out from the coast in anything that would float. On May 2nd, Vice Admiral Steele reported to Pacific Fleet Headquarters. For past 24 hours, TF-76 has been working fast and furious, loading evacuees into MSC ship Ping. However, it became obvious this morning that we were not making enough progress. New evacuees were arriving at a rate equal to or greater than the ship embark rate from the barges from Con Sun Island. We are being faced with the choice of forcibly keeping the boats away from the MSC ships or giving the evacuees in the boat safe haven. The choice was obvious. The only way to load the evacuees off both the barges and indigenous boats and get the TF-76/MSC ships underway before additional boats arrived from land and the situation became beyond our control, was to simultaneously offload the barges to the MSC ships and to TF-76 units. With a lot of hustle from all hands, definite progress is now being made. The 7th Fleet Commander sought to turn the tide by moving the holding area for Task Force 76 to a position 100 miles southeast of Vung Tau. As Vice Admiral Steele later explained, I was reluctant to pick up a whole lot of these people, unless it was quite clear that if we didn't do it, they were going to die. And I moved the fleet out from the coast so that they wouldn't see us, because after having watched the chaotic evacuation from Da Nang and Cam Ranh Bay, I had this feeling that we were taking poor people who probably were going to be all right, who the regime on top wasn't going to touch very much. They would not be taken away from a life they knew and transplanted someplace, which I didn't think was the most humane thing to do. So in my view, and I was sort of left to my own devices, at least, to begin with on this, we would only take those aboard who wouldn't hurt the operation of the ship. In other words, they wouldn't swamp the ship, and B, that if we didn't take them aboard, they'd probably die. If they had the means to get back to shore, we would tell them to go home. About this time, May 2nd, we got a set of strict orders from the JCS to stop. Apparently, they got panicky back in Washington as they realized the number of people that we were taking off. We were reporting it. Even with my restrictive guidelines, they said to stop picking up people. My P3s going around looking saw evidence that there were quite a few people out there floating around. So I said to Admiral Weissner, "Gee, this is in Mana. I think we ought to sweep the area and pick up any mariners, any people who are in distress out there, where they're obviously about to die. We need to do this quickly." There was a pause. on the line, and Admiral Weissner came back and said, "You may do that from the air." And I kept 2 ships in there. The problem didn't turn out to be really as severe as I expected. Ultimately, some of the Vietnamese were rescued by passing merchantmen, others put back into port. Some of them may have just plain perished, and a few we picked up. But the thing kind of wound down after 5 or 6 days. They realized that we were gone, and people didn't set out from the coast anymore. At least, not many. But stragglers did appear for some time. On May 7th, AP 3 spotted a Cambodian patrol boat and 2 other craft laden with 713 refugees. On May 8th, sailors from the guided missile escort Ramsey, D2, boarded the vessels and broke out the U.S. flag prior to ushering them to a Philippine harbor. From Singapore alone, during the 2 weeks following the fall of South Vietnam, 23 ships with 6,289 refugees left port. Most of the craft headed for Guam, although some entered Philippine waters. In spite of rigid orders from higher author, ITY, flexibility remained the standard operating procedure for Task 476 when dealing with so many additional asylum seekers. When Midway anchored off Utapao to embark South Vietnamese aircraft flown to Thailand, a boatload of refugees approached the carrier asking for assistance. Because of the JCS order directing cessation of all rescue operations, Vice Admiral Steele ordered one. Boarding of refugees in international waters and USN ships is authorized only in cases of dire emergency. 2. Under no circumstances will refugees be taken aboard in the territorial waters of another state. Yet when the Vietnamese boat began taking on water in heavy seas, the circumstances were evaluated as a humanitarian situation, and the carrier took the 84 South Vietnamese aboard. On May 8, 1975, sailors from USS Ramsey, DG-2, boarded a Cambodian patrol boat and 2 other vessels laden with refugees, reflagged them, and escorted them to the Philippines. Former South Vietnamese and Cambodian NAVY ships shown on May 31st, 1975, tied up at buoy number 1 in Subic Bay, Philippines, after bringing in refugees. They are left to Right Vietnam Nav YHQ 471, Donda 207, Chi Lang 208, Chi Lin 11, and Cambodian ships P 112 and E 312. A Nav Y doctor cares for a Vietnamese woman ill after the long, arduous sea passage from South Vietnam to the Philippines in May 1975. Succor in the Philippines and Guam. A larger challenge to the U.S. government lay in finding host countries for the expatriates. Even before frequent wind, South Vietnamese had flowed into the Subic Bay Naval Base, the principal U.S. Navy installation in the Philippines. By April 28th, almost 5,000 evacuees filled the center established for them at Grande Island. Following the fall of Saigon, Rear Admiral Whitmire, commander of Task 476, estimated the number of all the evacuees aboard U.S. Navy, MSC, or Vietnam Navy vessels at 80,000. A SINCPAC estimate on May 3rd pegged the number slightly lower, approximately 70,000 refugees currently on water in USN/MSC/VNN ships. The Philippines government did not roll out the welcome mat, afraid of being overwhelmed with indigents, and uncertain about the shape of the new order in Southeast Asia. Manila refused initially to allow evacuees to debark, a policy acceded to by the JCS, which ordered the refugee vessels to sail right on to Guam, as Vice Admiral Steele remembered his protest to Admiral Weissner. These ships are coming in, and they're overloaded, and their conditions on board are bad, and people are liable to die. We are seeing evidence of this. And I think this is an inhumane policy that I can't believe is intended by the JCS. And here's the way I think the policy ought to be. But I also suggested that it would be considered to be a racial thing in the United States if we treated Vietnamese as far as their physical safety and health were concerned, in a way different than we treated Americans and generally white citizens. Any command structure is always, if it's operating properly, a medium for the exchange of orders and complaints about the orders. It's a form of legitimate insubordinate tie-in, if you will. In the end, a way was found to bring the refugees ashore in the Philippines with the concurrence of President Ferdinand Marcos. To avert problems with the Philippines government while providing the refugees with much-needed relief, the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, William H. Sullivan, proposed hoisting the U.S. flag over the South Vietnamese vessels a day before they reached Subic Bay. Singpak and the 7th Fleet commander agreed. As the refugee vessels neared Philippine waters, Marine security teams boarded them and brought them into port as U.S. ships with a U.S. Navy officer in command of each one, thus ending anticlimactically a portion of the South Vietnamese Navy and reincorporating the U.S.-built ships into U.S. custody. In a formal ceremony, the last South Vietnamese CNO, Vice Admiral Chung Tan Song, handed over command of his flotilla to the American commander of Destroyer Squadron 23. The refugee flotilla entered Subic Bay on 7th May. Prior to transferring their ship to U.S. custody, officers and men of the Vietnam Nav stand at attention as their nation's flag is lowered for the last time. The escort Ngoc Hoi, HQ-12, a veteran Vietnam Nav warship that made the transit from Saigon to the U.S. Naval base at Subic Bay in the Philippines in May 1975. A Nav corpsman treats patients in an ambulance at Subic Bay in the Philippines. The refugee tent camp at Grand Isle in the Philippines. The war is over for these former South Vietnamese and Cambodian naval vessels tied up at the pier in Subic Bay. Under cover of this fig leaf, the refugees were Oro Point. Naval Air Station Agana and Naval Station Guam took care of the arrivals, some of whom were put up in military housing, even hotels. But as the refugee flights increased, the thousands of evacuees quickly overwhelmed available facilities as well as the medical and processing personnel. On 25 April, the island got a 2-day respite when the State Department ordered the diversion of all refugees to the Philippines and Wake Island, the latter holding 2,113 evacuees by April 29th. By the resumption of flights into Guam on April 27th, Oro Point was open for business with a capacity of 13,000. A rapid expansion of the 340-acre facility allowed it to accommodate up to 50,000 people by April 29th. One refugee remembered tens of thousands of tents stretched in rows in every direction. They'd been allowed a respite at Subic and time ashore while the ships prepared for their journey onward to Guam. The ships equalized their passenger loads and replenished their larders with supplies ranging from water to baby diapers. At Guam, authorities had for some time braced for the onslaught. On April 22nd, the State Department designated the island as the initial safe haven for the refugees. The following day, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the establishment of a refugee center in the Oro Point area. Seabees began work immediately constructing a tent city and refurbishing buildings at the unused ASIN Annex of the Navy's Regional Medical Center. The first Vietnam evacuees arrived by air on Guam, April 23rd. while the Seabees cleared land at. Nav YCB prepares the ground for a tent city at Orot. Point on Guam during May 1975. Vietnamese refugees in the hold of an evacuation ship as it makes port in Guam in May 1975 after weeks at sea. Many of these refugees suffered not only from dehydration, but a host of infectious diseases. A Navy nurse hones her skills on Guam. In May 1975, early in her nursing career at the Naval Hospital Philadelphia, Lieutenant Gigi Odette Willis, barely 21 years old, suddenly found herself on her way to Guam. Assigned to an acute care surgical unit, she witnessed firsthand the arrival of a ship loaded with Southeast Asian refugees. When they opened the hatch, I saw a sea of people. It looked just like someone had opened a can of worms with body after body tangled together. Some of these vessels had been at sea for 30 days before they got to Guam. A few of the refugees were carrying suitcases full of money, but most were poor. Ranging in age from newborns to centenarians, virtually all were dehydrated and needed immediate medical attention. During my first night at the hospital, I put in IVs, inserted Foley catheters, put down nasogastric tubes. In fact, I learned more nursing skills the first night I was there than I had in the 2 years I was at Philadelphia. These people were in frightful condition. They were so dehydrated we were hanging 1 an hour on some of them. Other health problems proved more exotic. One teenage girl had worms that had actually grown in her lungs and had been given deworming medication. Whenever she began cough, you had to grab a pair of gloves and run to help her. A worm was coming up, and it was necessary to help pull it out before she choked to death. As the physical condition of the patient's gradu ally improved, other problems surfaced. Certain unfamiliar foods caused gastric disturbances. Hence, the hospital mess served a rice-based diet for the longest time. Many of the refugees had been separated from their families, and they stood for hours laboriously searching the lists of other camps for the names of relatives. Lieutenant Willis wrote in her journal of 2 elderly women. They were walking slowly arm in, arm up, and down the ward. They help each other in and out of bed and tend to each other's needs. Their families, lost in the shuffle of the evacuation and the refugee camps, are gone, and now all they have is each other. The nearby air bases posed a different sort of problem. Every time a plane landed or took off, it came over the hospital, and those people would scatter. They often ended up underneath the beds, huddling and scared to death, because this was a sound they knew. When a plane came over, it meant a bomb was about to drop on them. A different sort of challenge to the staff arose when one woman delivered her 7th boy and another her 6th girl. Just as we were discharging one of the families, we realized that the mother did not have the right baby. We couldn't figure it out, so we took the baby back to the nursery. The mother who had given birth to the boy had the girl. The mother, with all the girls, had the boy. An interro wrote on Guam. Preeter told us what was going on. Both mothers had all the same sex children. They didn't want the same sex, so they simply swapped them. In their country, that would have been perfectly okay, because the babies were technically born in the United States. We could not allow them to just swap babies, so we kept them an extra day and went through a complete adoption process so they could take each other's babies home. Looking back on that hectic time, Lieutenant J.G. Willis recalls, it was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Not only did I learn far more nursing than I ever imagined, but helping people who wouldn't be helped otherwise was a superb experience. It was hard work and long hours in wretched conditions, but it was worth it. Lieutenant J.G. Odette Willis holds a Vietnamese child at camp. Odette Willis, who retired as a captain after 30 years of service, poses for a photo in 1998 with Rear Admiral Joan Marie Engel. director of the Nurse Corps. The occasion was the 90th anniversary of the Nurse Corps. Vietnamese refugees go about their daily activities at a tent encampment on Guam. Little attempt to clear the terrain, which was just red coral mud and brush. Construction barely kept pace with demand. By April 30th, the number of refugees on Guam reached almost 31,000. On May 13th, that number totaled 50,430. The emergency stretched resources to the utmost. Providing for the refugees was truly a joint operation with the Army's 45th Support Group, assuming camp command, and its 25th Infantry Division erecting field kitchens at the Oro Point site, while the American Red Cross oversaw the distribution of food. With the weather hot and dry and the number of expatriates huge, the U.S. Command was compelled to enforce water conservation measures on the refugees and on the Guamanian civilian community. Although most refugees arriving on the island by air were in reason ably good physical condition, the medical burden was still substantial. The Army took responsibility for outpatient care, while the Navy's Regional Medical Center concentrated on those with inpatient needs. Staffers from Senator Edward M. Ted Kennedy's Democrat Massachusetts Subcommittee on Refugees concluded the Navy and the other armed services had done well by the evacuees. Vice Admiral Tsang echoed this favorable appraisal, saying of the American relief efforts, they did the most they could to provide assistance to the refugees. Their attitude and capability ties were excellent. No one suspected that so many refugees would be coming at once. But Guam had never been intended as anything more than a way station. The ultimate destination for most refugees was the continental United States in what was ultimately dubbed Operation New Life. On April 26th, days before the Saigon evacuation, the JCS directed the armed services designate reception centers in the United States. Among its facilities, the Navy chose Camp Pendleton and Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California. And on the East Coast, the naval air stations at Albany, New York, and Glencoe, Georgia. By late May, almost 50,000 refugees had reached facilities on the U.S. mainland. The State Department also approached, with varying degrees of success, diverse other countries, e.g., Antigua, Canada, Dominica, Ghana, Republic of China, to provide permanent homes for some of the refugees. As the refugee problem came under control, the forces that conducted frequent wind scattered to the four winds. Midway steamed to Thai waters to offload her 10 Air Force SH/HH-53 helicopters and to take aboard for transportation to the Philippines as many former Vietnam Air Force aircraft as possible. Loading did not go smoothly. 2 F-5E aircraft being transferred by helicopter from Utapao to the carrier were lost at sea due to sling failure. Eventually, Midway departed for the United States with 24 F-5s and 27 A-37s, most brought out to the ship by barge, plus 50 helicopters. Other U.S. warships returned 39 additional helicopters, 14 Air America, 25 Vietnam Air Force, to the United States. Meanwhile, as the 7th Fleet flagship Oklahoma City headed for Japan, Enterprise and Hancock put into Subic Bay, where Hancock debarked refugees prior to her return to attack carrier status. Originally scheduled for an April 16th return to the West Coast, Enterprise steamed for Hawaii on May 5th with 16 of the Marine CH-53 helicopters from Hancock. The 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade, formed on March 26th for the evacuation, was formally deactivated on May 12th. The unit's dissolution would be short-lived as events in Southeast Asia once again demanded a U.S. Navy response. Refugees line up for a meal on Guam. A helicopter prepares to transport a fighter to the carrier midway, steaming in the Gulf of Thailand. A South Vietnamese aircrew fleeing Saigon at the end of April 1975 abandoned this Northrop F-5 in Thailand. Shortly after Air Force aircraft doused SS Mayaguez with tear gas, an armed U.S. Marine prepares to board the merchant ship from Harold E. Holt. The recovery of SS Mayaguez. That same day, Cambodian Communist forces, the Khmer Rouge, fired on and seized the American container ship, SS Mayaguez, sailing in international waters in the Gulf of Thailand. The ship's radio operator got off distress calls before the hostile boarders shut down communications. The Khmer Rouge moved the captured ship to an anchorage, a mile off the island of Koh Tang, about 34 miles from the Cambodian port of Kampong Som, which has since reverted back to its former name, Sihanoukville. President Gerald R. Ford authorized the immediate use of force to recapture SS Mayaguez from the Khmer Rouge. News of the seizure reached Washington in the morning hours of May 13th, and a Navy P-3 Orion quickly spotted Mayaguez dead in the water. The patrol plane, hit by one round of small arms fire, saw no sign of the merchantman's crew. Another surveillance aircraft reported later in the day some seamen had been moved to nearby Koh Tang. On May 14th, additional reports reaching Washington indicated the Cambodians had transferred some of the crew to Kampong Som. In fact, unknown to U.S. authorities, the captors moved all of the men to that city on the 14th. Meanwhile, the National Security Council, meeting in emergency session, called for the U.S. military to forcibly recover the ship and crew. Although this course of action entailed obvious risks, the Ford administration remembered North Korea's 1968 capture of the research ship Pueblo, Agar II, and her crew, who were tortured. U.S. humiliation at the loss that spring of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and fears of the Khmer Rouge, who were even then carrying out large-scale executions of opponents in Phnom Penh, would brutalize the Mayaguez seamen. U.S. resolve stiffened further when 3 U.S. reconnaissance aircraft suffered damage from communist gunners on Koh Tang, small boats in the area. And on Mayaguez herself, planners faced the immediate problem that American sea power, now widely dispersed following frequent wind, needed to be pulled back to the theater. The closest ships to Cambodia were the destroyer escort Harold Holt, the 1074, and the store ship Vega, F-59. Both received orders on 12. Made a steam to the scene. The next day, the guided missile destroyer Henry B. Wilson, en route to the Philippines, turned back to Cambodia. Washington ordered the destroyer escort Harold E. Holt, one of 2 U.S. naval vessels in the area, to steam at flank. Speed to the scene of Mayaguez's seizure. Guided missile destroyer Henry B. Wilson, en route to the Philippines, turned back to Cambodia. To lend air cover and striking power, Coral Sea and her escorts were diverted from a planned Australian visit. Scheduled for a later arrival on May 16th was Hancock, undergoing repairs to her engineering plant. The attack carrier would again be flying a substantial complement of rotary wing aircraft, including 11 of the big CH-53 DC Stallions. The amphibious assault ship Okinawa, doubling back from passage to the island of Okinawa, would reach the scene on May 18th with 23 helicopters. The Ford administration could count on substantial Air Force strength in the vicinity as well. Based in Thailand were the 40th Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron with 9 HH-53CS, as well as the 21st Special Operations Squadron with 10 CH-53CS. the latter being tough aircraft with side-mounted multi-barrel guns. Unfortunately, neither Air Force unit was trained in landing troops under hostile fire. As potential compensation, 7th Air Force assets included 7D attack aircraft, AC-130 gunships, and OV-10 forward air control aircraft that could provide additional cover for the rescue mission. Commanding these forces was the same officer who had exercised similar control during the Eagle Pull and frequent wind operations, Lieutenant General Burns, Commander of the U.S. Support Activities Group and Commanding General of the 7th Air Force, with headquarters at Nakhon Phanom Royal Thai Air Force Base. Because treaty arrangements prohibited the United States from stationing ground units in Thailand, the nearest available troops were Marines in Okinawa and the Philippines. Those men training at Subic Bay went on alert May 13th, and 120 Marines of Battalion Landing Team, BLT, one quarter departed QB Point May 14th aboard U.S. Air Force transports for Utapao, Thailand. They were joined quickly by 1,000 Marines of BLT-29 who flew in on 15 C-141s from Okinawa, 2,000 miles away. To provide the Marines with tactical airlift, 7th Air Force CH-53s headed for Utapao. One crashed en route, killing 23 men. Despite this loss, by May 15th the Marine troops and the Air Force helicopters, backed by Navy and Air Force tactical air power, were ready for action. As with Eagle Pull and frequent wind, command lines of authority for the Mayaguez recovery were tangled. CINCPAC, Admiral Weissner, exercised overall administrative control of the forces involved. The local operational coordinating authority was once again Air Force Lieutenant General Burns, but his command post was 400 miles north of the Anchor Mayaguez. His immediate deputy closer to the scene of impending action was the Airborne Mission Commander, AMC, in the Airborne Command and Control Center, ABCCC, orbiting about 90 miles northwest of Koh Tang. Although Marine and Navy forces were not formally commanded by that officer, they were under his operational control. The previous month, similarly convoluted command arrangements had worked reasonably well. Now in May, they were to cause serious problems. Adding to these command complexities, Washington frequently intervened directly in the ongoing operation. For example, the officer in TAC D, Cal Command on Harold E. Holt found himself in constant voice communications with the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon, and at times he spoke directly with Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Holloway. At times he spoke directly with Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Holloway. Admiral James L. Holloway III, the Chief of Naval Operations in 1975. Sailors and Marines returning to Harold E. Holt after discovering the merchant ship unoccupied and adrift. On the morning of May 14th, the 120 men of BLT, one quarter divided into 6 boarding teams, and rehearsed the next day's planned assault of Mayaguez on a schematic of the ship chalked onto the surface of a parking lot in Utapao. Simultaneous with this operation, on the morning of May 15th, other BLT January 4th, Marines would storm Koh Tang Island while carrier planes bombarded Kampong Som in Koh Tang. Lacking sufficient aircraft for all the tasks assigned them, Air Force helicopters would have to transfer the Marines to Harold E. Holt and then move on Koh Tang. The Marines slated to board Mayaguez would have to do so from the deck of the warship. Steaming at 25 knots, Harold E. Holt received orders on May 13th to proceed at flank speed to reach the scene in the early morning hours of May 15th. Although the ship's machinery under this sustained maximum load was suspect, what broke was the Henry E. Holt's 5-inch 54 caliber 45 Malawian Quach's gun mount during test firing, lacking essential spare parts. The ship's fire control technicians ingeniously recaded a replacement for a faulty piece of gear. The destroyer escort reached the scene with her main armament fully operational. In the dawn hours of May 15th, Harold E. Holt rendezvoused with 3 hovering Air Force helicopters that lowered 68 men onto her pitching deck. Following a run by 2 Air Force A-7s that drenched Mayaguez with tear gas, Harold Holt came alongside the container ship. For the first time in many years, the command rang out. Marines over the side, wearing gas masks, the boarding detachment. Sailors ready M60 machine guns and other weapons during the Mayaguez operation. After hoisting the American flag, the Marines and sailors from Henry B. Holt prepared the container ship for towing, while 6 MSE volunteers from USNS Greenville Victory restored emergency diesel power to the ship's plant. Merchant mariners from SS Greenville Victory discuss with Commander Robert A. Peterson, commanding officer of Harold E. Holt, how they will prepare SS Mayaguez for a tow. Marines disembarked from CH-53 on the island of Koh Tang on May 15, 1975. The battle for Koh Tang. Far less successful in its outcome was the operation against Koh Tang. While preparing to assault the island, planners were operating in a vacuum. Initially, they lacked decent maps and aerial photographs of the terrain. Worse, intelligence estimates regarding the communist forces on the scene varied significantly, positing at one extreme an enemy force of a mere 20 militiamen to Pacific Command's warning, of more than 200 regular troops equipped with recoilless rifles, mortars, and machine guns. Unhappily, the latter estimate never reached the Marine assault force, who believed they faced a small garrison of irregulars. Given the tenacity of the resistance U.S. forces ultimately encountered, the American ground commander later calculated the enemy force consisted of about 150 professional soldiers, well armed with heave-Y infantry weapons. Despite the significant uncertainties concerning the enemy on Koh Tang, the command authority vested in the 7th Air Force at Nakam Phantom did not delay the Marine attack until more precise information or combat support could be made available, close to the scene or available within a few hours were the air group of the approaching carrier Coral Sea. The 5-inch, 54 caliber 42 Malawian Quach's guns on Harold E. Holt and Henry B. Wilson, as well as AC-130 Spectre attack aircraft based in Thailand. But when the first wave of 180 men on 8 Air Force helicopters, 5 CH-53s and 3 HH-53s, approached the Koh Tang landing zones, none of these supporting assets were immediately available. Thus, the big helicopters flew into the teeth of an enemy unmolested by any sort of preparatory bombardment. Fierce fire from the ground shot down the first 3 helicopters. 14 men died. 3 more aircraft suffered major damage shortly thereafter. Of the 180 servicemen in the helicopters, only 131 were inserted successfully. Throughout the morning, enemy weapons pinned down the Americans ashore. Henry B. Wilson moved in close to Koh Tang and rescued 13 survivors from one of the helicopters that crashed in the water. Shortly after noon, 5 Air Force helicopters brought in 127 reinforcements from BLT-2 Ninths, but ground fire flared so intensely only 4 aircraft could disembark their 100 troops. Following the loss of the first 3 helicopters, the Air Force dispatched AC-130 gunships to Koh Tang. When the lead aircraft arrived, it eyed-in-typified itself to the beleaguered Marines and fired several spotting rounds, followed by a 105 millimeters projectile that demolished a Khmer Rouge bunker. This shot prompted the Marine communicator to exclaim, "Jesus Christ, what was that? Have I got targets for you?" Smoke rises from a warehouse in the Cambodian port of Kampong Som, formerly Sihanoukville, bombed by aircraft from the attack carrier Coral Sea. Concurrently, Coral Sea began launching the 61 sorties that over the course of the day hit targets around Kampong Som, including a rail yard, port facilities, a refinery, and an airfield. Bombs and cannon fire from Navy A-7 Corsairs and A-6 Henry B. Wilson DDG-7, playing an important role in the evacuation. From South Vietnam and the recovery of Mayaguez and her crew was the guided missile destroyer Henry B. Wilson, one of the 23 Charles F. Adams class destroyers built during the 1955 to 1961 tenure of Chief of Naval Operations Arleigh A. Burke. Henry B. Wilson, like others in the class, was a capable ship despite its relatively small size, for 1,500 tons at full load. Armament included two 5-inch, 54 caliber 42 Malawian Quachas gun mounts for shore bombardment and surface ship combat. The ship boasted a potent short-range anti-aircraft capability with its Tartar surface-to-air missile launcher. To counter submarines, the destroyer featured keel-mounted sensors 612, 75-inch torpedo tubes, and an 8-cell anti-submarine rocket ASROC launcher. Because of their small size, the Charles F. Adams-class destroyers could not house aircraft. But helicopters could deliver supplies at a specially designated station on the fantail. Handsome ships, they proved especially stable and maneuverable. Crews appreciated their relatively spacious accommodations and the air conditioning in all living and working spaces. The 1,200-pound high-pressure steam plants produced 70,000 horsepower, giving the warships a rated maximum of 31.5 knots, a speed frequently exceeded in practice. Henry B. Wilson enjoyed several distinctions. The firm of Defoe Shipbuilding at Bay City, Michigan, won the contract for the destroyer as the St. Lawrence Seaway was being finished. When laid down in February 1958, Henry B. Wilson was the largest warship constructed at that time on the Great Lakes. On April 22, 1959, she became the first vessel of her size to be side-launched. Completed in the fall of 1960, Henry B. Wilson left Defoe's yard just before ice closed the seaway for the winter. After transiting the 15 locks between Lake Erie and the sea, the ship arrived on schedule in Boston for the commissioning ceremony December 17th. The guided missile destroyer Henry B. Wilson underway in 1975. Intruders destroyed 3 aircraft and numerous small buildings at the Fiume Sarim Naval Base. Another 4 A-7ES sank a small Khmer Rouge Navy patrol craft. In addition to these strike duties, Coral Sea aircraft flew photo reconnaissance and combat air patrol missions, plus 4 helicopter sorties in support of the extraction of the ground force on Koh Tang. By the end of the engagement, the attack carrier was only 10 miles from the island. During the afternoon, Henry B. Wilson, aided by OV-10 forward air control aircraft, fired 157 5-inch rounds to support the Marines on the eastern side of the destroyer, made a significant contribution during the Mayaguez operation. Right after taking part in Operation Frequent Wind, on May 13th, as the ship and her crew headed to the Philippines for well-deserved liberty, they received orders to reverse course and steam for Cambodian waters. The destroyer joined the fight off Koh Tang.
bombarding Khmer Rouge forces on the island with her 5-inch guns and rescuing 13 crewmen whose helicopter had been downed. To pull those men from the water, Henry B. Wilson's sailors approached the hostile shore in the ship's gig and traded small arms fire with the enemy. The Navy awarded 4 sailors the Bronze Star Medal for their bravery. In a fitting climax to a hectic day, Henry B. Wilson intercepted the Thai fishing craft carry. The crew of Mayaguez took the merchant mariners on board and returned the grateful men to their now liberated ship. Henry B. Wilson was decommissioned on October 2, 1989, which capped the warship's distinguished career. A Navy A-7 Corsair II prepares for a carrier launch with a full load of ordnance. In the summer of 1965, Henry B. Wilson began almost a decade of service in Southeast Asia. Steaming in the Gulf of Tonkin, the destroyer protected the aircraft carriers at Yankee Station and used her artillery to pound North Vietnamese coastal installa tie-ins as part of Operation Sea Dragon. The warship completed 7 deployments to the Southeast Asian Combat Theater. Smoke rounds fired by Henry B. Wilson on the eastern side of Koh Tang enabled a Marine platoon to board Air Force helicopters for the withdrawal from the deadly island. The ship's 5-inch guns put rounds ashore at key times during the engagement. Koh Tang, one airman later remembered. I guess most of us in the Air Force aren't aware of just how well the Navy can thread the needle on precision gunfire. The Navy started walking rounds in some distance to the right of one of the gun positions. The Marines were making 5-meter adjustments on the naval gunfire. That Navy destroyer was literally able, by a succession of shots, to walk its rounds right into the machine gun positions. A number of positions were knocked out this way. The Marines were extracted by helicopter, while the destroyer operated to divert the enemy's attention. Holt could not join this action because the destroyer escort was fully committed to the board, and later towing of Mayaguez. The combat on May 15th occurred after the Phnom Penh government was already backing away from the confrontation with the United States. That morning, the Khmer Rouge military had loaded the crew of Mayaguez aboard a Thai fishing vessel and sent it seaward. Alerted by AP-3 patrol plane, Henry B. Wilson intercepted this craft and placed the 40 merchant sailors back aboard Mayaguez, at that point under tow by Harold E. Holt. By evening, Mayaguez was manned by her own crew and steam-NG in international waters under her own power. Henry B. Wilson remained on the scene until May 18th to support the recovery of U.S. dead. 2 days later, the destroyer entered Subic Bay. Shortly after the second wave of helicopters deposited their Marines on Koh Tang, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, learning of the recovery of Mayaguez and the release of the crew, ordered all offensive action halted and the forces fighting on Koh Tang extracted. This retrograde movement proved as tough to execute as had the morning insertions. Of the 5 helicopters that plucked the Marines from Koh Tang to Coral Sea and Harold E. Holt, 3 received major damage. Of the 231 men landed on the island, 227 were evacuated, 1 was killed in action, and 3 were inadvertently left behind to be murdered by the Khmer Rouge. Total fatalities in the operation were 14 Marines, 2 sailors, and 2 airmen. 70 men suffered wounds, mostly burns and lacerations, of sufficient seriousness to require treatment aboard Coral Sea. Of the 21 helicopters that took small arms fire during the operation, 13 were lost or damaged. So overwhelmed were the rotary wing aircraft that some after-action defense analysts questioned the very utility of amphibious helicopter assault in future military operations. A closer look at the evidence moderated this skepticism. One of the most careful assessments of the assault on Koh Tang was prepared by the Center for Naval Analyses, CNA, that concluded the losses were attributable not to any inherent vulnerability in helicopters, but rather to a host of other factors. The CNA report addressed the command and control issue guardedly. A joint commander of a small operation becomes involved in details that normally would be left to component commanders in larger operations. This factor should be carefully considered before designating a commander of a joint operation when the major mission area lies outside his service experience. More specifically, the CNA report concluded the command and control system was too centralized, with the reins held by 7th Air Force, and the on-scene commander, ABCCC, remained too far removed from the action to early control the air and naval forces under his oversight. Other flaws included the lack of an effective forward air controller until late in the operation, the limited training of the Air Force helicopters performing the vertical envelopment mission, and the late use of powerful naval assets, including the guns on board Henry B. Wilson and Harold E. Holt and the attack aircraft of Coral Sea. In reality, then the Mayaguez rescue effort, although ostensibly successful, sounded a distinctly sour note when compared to Eagle Pull and Frequent Wind. In those earlier operations, the U.S. military, especially the Navy and Marine Corps, demonstrated extraordinary professional skill in carrying out large-scale and complicated evacuations. Given the public's contemporary skepticism of American servicemen at the tail end of the Vietnam War, this performance seems at first glance surprising. But despite the undeniable litany of woes afflicting the military in 1975, racial tensions, counterculture sentiment, drug abuse, the lower quality of recruits, the record compiled by these Americans in uniform showed that not all was dark, that the services retained a solid core of competent and dedicated people, and that with proper nurturing, the armed forces could be restored to health as they were in the 1980s. In fact, the performance of these military personnel in April 1975 was a harbinger of the future. Despite a tangled command structure and amid an atmosphere of intense crisis and extreme danger, American sailors, Marines, and airmen saved tens of thousands of people with a minimal loss of life. In the subsequent Operation New Life, military men and women pitched in to help unfortunate refugees make the transition to homes on U.S. soil. If the public's view of the final collapse in Southeast Asia is one of unalloyed tragedy, then that jaundiced assess needs to be leavened with a tribute to those Americans who carried out their duties so well and in such trying circumstances. Major Raymond Porter and another Marine raised the Stars and Stripes over SS Mayaguez. The author, Malcolm Muir, Jr., a military historian who received his degrees from Emory, Georgia, Florida State, and Ohio State universities, served on the faculty of the Virginia Military Institute from 2003 to his retirement in 2011, having taught at Austin Peay State University for 25 years prior to 2003. He also held the Secretary of the Navy's Research Chair in Naval History and visiting positions at the U.S. Military Academy and the Air War College. Among his publications are several books, including Black Shoes and Blue Water, Surface Warfare in the U.S. Navy, 1945 to 1975, Washington, 1996, recipient of the North American Society for Oceanic History's John Lyman Book Award in 1997. Acknowledgements. I am especially grateful to Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, USN, Ret. Director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, for his unstinting support of this project, and Dr. Edward J. Marolda, series co-editor, who was instrumental in bringing this booklet to fruition. Equally deserving of my thanks are Admiral Bruce DeMars, USN Ret, Vice Admiral Robert P. Dunn, USN Ret, and Captain Todd Creekman, USN Ret. Distinguished leaders of the Naval Historical Foundation who enthusiastically endorsed this effort to recognize the service and sacrifice in Vietnam of our naval personnel and the Navy's vital contribution. Yushin to the war effort. Former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, Captain Odette Willis, NC, USN Ret, Captain Paul Jacobs, USN Ret, Liam Bowie, Craig Compiano, Jan Herman, and Hugh Doyle graciously provided their personal images for use in this booklet. The staff members of the Naval History and Heritage Command who helped publish this booklet include editors Deborah Barker, Andrea Connell, and Amy Carfagno, photo archivists Lisa Crunk and David Colamaria, and art curators Gail Monroe, Pamela Overman, and Karen Hobbold. I thank Karen Newcomer of Marine Corps History Division for her help in the photo and map selection process. Finally, I am grateful to Dr. John Sherwood, a historian of the NHC, and Jan Herman, former historian of the Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, for their insightful reviews of the manuscript. Publisher's note: the Naval History and Heritage Command extends a grateful thank you to the Naval Historical Foundation for making the U.S. Navy and the Vietnam War series possible. They generously sponsored not only the author's work on this book, but also the subsequent editorial services that helped make it reality. The NHHC is grateful for the NHF support and its dedication to telling the story of this important era in the Navy's history. Suggested reading: Du, Kim, and Julie Kane. Counterpart: A South Vietnamese Naval Officers' War. Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute Press, 1998. Dunham, George R., U.S. Marines in Vietnam, The Bitter End. 1973-1975, Marine Corps. Vietnam Operational Historical Series. Quantico, V.A., Marine Corps Association, 1990. Gilmartin, John F. Jr. of Very Short War. The Mayaguez and the Battle of Ko Tang. College. Station. Texas A&M University Press, 1995. Herman, Jan K. Navy Medicine in Vietnam. Oral Histories from Dien Bien Phu to the Fall of Saigon. Jefferson, North Carolina. McFarland, 2009. Isaacs. Arnzeter. Without Honor. Defeat in Vietnam and Cambodia. Baltimore, Johns Hopkins. University Press, 1983. Marolda, Edward J. By Sea, Air, and Land. An Illustrated History of the United States Navy and the War in Southeast Asia. Washington, D.C. Naval Historical Center, 1994. Mercogliano, Salvatore. Fourth Arm of Defense. Sealift and Maritime Logistics in the Vietnam. VA. Washington, D.C. Naval History and Heritage Command, forthcoming. Snep, Frank. Decent Interval. New York. Vintage Books, 1977. Todd, Olivier. Cruel April. The Fall of Saigon. New York. W. W. Norton and Company Incorporated. 1990. Urey, Patrick. U.S. Marine Corps participation in the emergency evacuations of Phnom Penh and Saigon. Operations Eagle Pull and Frequent Wind. Alexandria, Virginia. Center for Naval Analysis, Study 1089, Juni 1977. Veith, George J. Black April. The Fall of South Vietnam, 1973 to 1975. New York. Encounter. Books, 2012. Vien, Cao Van, The Final Collapse. Washington, D.C., Center of Military History / GPO, 1983. Wetterhahn, Ralph. The Last Battle. The Mayaguez Incident and the End of the Vietnam War. New York, Carroll and Graf, 2001. Wilbanks, James H. Abandoning Vietnam. How America Left and South Vietnam Lost Its War. Lawrence. University Press of Kansas, 2004. Wise, James E. Jr. and Scott Barron. The 14-Hour War. Valor on Koh Tang and the Recapture of the SS Mayaguez. Annapolis, Maryland. Naval Institute Press, 2011.